On.
Live streaming is on.
Abro cámara.
Buenos días. Good morning to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, and midnight for some people, I believe so. If you allow me, I will speak first in Spanish and then go in English. Buenos días a todos, a los panelistas, a las personas que nos siguen en el streaming de YouTube. Estimada Natalia, que representa a CLACSO, la organización que coauspicia esta sexta conferencia de estudios estratégicos. Mi nombre es José Ramón Cabañas Rodríguez y desde el pasado mes de marzo estoy al frente del Centro de Investigaciones de Política Internacional, CIPI, en La Habana, Cuba. Durante 5 reuniones anteriores, ustedes fueron acogidos en Cuba, vinieron acá físicamente algunos de ustedes y fueron acogidos por el doctor Adalberto Ronda, que nos acompaña hoy, está siguiendo el evento, y el resto del equipo del centro. Hoy proponemos un formato distinto, pues a pesar de que ya Cuba ha reabierto sus fronteras, la situación de la pandemia de la COVID-19 está bajo control y la inmensa mayoría de nuestra población está vacunada. En la etapa de organización nos pareció mejor hacer el evento de esta manera hasta que todas las zonas geográficas pudieran ir pasando a lo que se llama la nueva normalidad. Trabajaremos durante 3 mañanas por la hora de La Habana y en 3 paneles distintos que hemos convocado a partir de los ejes temáticos que se definieron en la convocatoria, que nosotros pudimos divulgar oportunamente. Agradecemos a todos los panelistas que estarán con nosotros el día de hoy, mañana y el día posterior, quienes han confirmado su presencia a pesar de múltiples compromisos, lo sabemos claramente. Pensamos que en la actual coyuntura que vive el mundo tiene una importancia de primer orden intercambiar criterios, articular iniciativas y visibilizar puntos de vista contestatarios a los que emanan desde los principales centros de poder, sus tanques pesantes asociados y que responden a la lógica de que la humanidad y el planeta en que vivimos pertenecen solo al gran capital. Ustedes han seguido las noticias de los últimos meses respecto a Cuba, tanto en la prensa corporativa como en las plataformas digitales gobernadas por algoritmos militares. La matriz que se fue imponiendo fue que Cuba atravesaba por una crisis definitiva, sin salida, razón por la cual se habrían sucedido reiteradas protestas masivas que además habrían sido reprimidas de forma brutal. El refuerzo del bloqueo bajo el gobierno de Donald Trump, el impacto de la COVID-19 y la inacción del gobierno de Biden hicieron pensar a algunos en un escenario similar a los años 90 del siglo XX, lo cual, unido a la desaparición física del comandante Fidel Castro, debía conducir al fin de la revolución. A pesar de que la toxicidad de la información ha llegado a extremos, la realidad va prevaleciendo poco a poco. El corazón de Cuba sigue latiendo, enfrentando retos y con conciencia de que nuestro gran pecado es ser diferentes. Estamos educados en la creencia martiana de que hay que conocer todas las culturas para crear la propia y en el principio de Ernesto Guevara de que para ser objetivos hay que soñar. Estimados académicos e investigadores extranjeros, sus propuestas serán siempre de interés para nosotros. Cuba seguirá siendo el país que vele por el equilibrio del mundo. Esperemos que en las próximas conferencias podamos encontrarnos físicamente y sostener un intenso intercambio desde varias posiciones para poder llegar a la verdad. May I have the opportunity to say the same words in English now? Some of you will feel better. My name is José Ramón Cabañas Rodríguez, and since March of this year, I have been in charge of the International Policy Research Center, CIPI, in Havana, Cuba. During the previous 5 meetings, many of you were welcomed in Cuba by Dr. Alberto Ronda, who is with us today, and the rest of the Centro team. Today, we propose a different format because despite the fact that Cuba has already reopened its borders, the situation of COVID-19 pandemic is under control and the vast majority of our population is vaccinated. During the organization stage, it seemed better to organize the meeting this way until all geographical areas can be part of the new normal. Whatever that means, we don't know yet. We will work for 3 mornings at Havana time in 3 different panels, which has been convened based on the thematic axes that were defined in the call for papers. We thank all the panelists who will be with us, who have confirmed their presence despite multiple commitments. We think that in the current conjuncture the world is experiencing, it is the utmost important to exchange criteria, articulate initiative, and make visible points of view in opposition to those that emanate from the main centers of power, their associated think tanks, and that respond to the logic that humanity and the planet where we live, all of that belong to the big capital. You have followed the news in recent months regarding Cuba, both on the corporate press, the corporate media, and in the digital platforms governed by military algorithm. The matrix that was imposed was that Cuba was going through a definitive crisis with no way out, which is why there would have been repeated massive protests, which would also have been repressed brutally. The reinforcement of the blockade on the Trump administration, the impact of COVID-19, and the inaction of the Biden government made some think of a scenario similar to the 90s of the 20th century, which together with the physical disappearance of Comandante Fidel Castro should lead to the end of the revolution. Despite the fact that information toxicity has reached extremes, reality is gradually prevailing. The heart of Cuba continues to beat, facing challenges, and with the awareness that our great sin is to be different. We are educated in Martín's belief that you have to know all cultures to create your own, and in Ernesto Guevara's principle that to be objective, you have to dream. Dear foreign scholars and researchers, your proposals will always be of interest for us. Cuba will continue to be the country that watches over the balance of the world. Let's hope that in the next conference we can meet physically and have an intense exchange from various positions in order to get the real truth. By saying that, I can declare open the conference. I think the representative from CLACSO will address us right now. Thank you again for your presence, and we'll certainly have a wonderful conversation this morning. Thank you again.
Bueno, muy buenos días para todas y para todos. Muchísimas gracias por esta invitación. Mi nombre es Natalia Gianatelli, soy coordinadora de investigación de CLACSO y quisiera transmitir algunas palabras y decirles que es un placer para CLACSO poder participar en la inauguración de esta 6ª Conferencia de Estudios Estratégicos, organizada por el Centro de Investigaciones de Política Internacional, el CIPI de La Habana, Cuba, con el auspicio del Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales. Y traigo un saludo muy especial de parte de Karina Batiani, secretaria ejecutiva de CLACSO, y de Pablo Omaro, director de investigación, quienes no pudieron estar presentes el día de hoy por diversos compromisos. Desde CLACSO, por supuesto, compartimos la urgencia por debatir sobre las dinámicas de las relaciones internacionales en este nuevo contexto mundial. CLACSO, desde su fundación, es una red latinoamericana y caribeña que está ligada a la tradición de la promoción del desarrollo y la integración de la región y la denuncia de las desigualdades y las situaciones de exclusión. Y durante el confinamiento buscamos sostener el encuentro entre las investigadores e investigadores con mirada crítica de todos los países de América Latina, promoviendo encuentros virtuales y difundiendo más que nunca el intercambio de experiencias y reflexiones sobre diversos problemas regionales que se desarrollaron en el marco de la pandemia. En este sentido, la apuesta de CLACSO fue facilitar y sostener el diálogo, la reflexión y la denuncia de las múltiples desigualdades que en este contexto no hicieron más que profundizarse y visibilizarse aún más. Nos complace mucho participar en este congreso en el que se desarrollarán debates que serán profundas contribuciones para pensar la complejidad de la situación regional. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias a Tania, al director, a Natalia, a Roberto Cabaña por las palabras inaugurales. Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Rainier Pellón, investigador del Centro de Investigaciones de Política Internacional. Me complace muchísimo poderlos acompañar en este prestigioso panel y moderar durante su sesión el panel que tiene como tema central salud, medio ambiente y tecnología como campos en disputa estratégica. Les voy a pedir, por favor, que los compañeros que no van a estar interviniendo en este momento cierren su micrófono hasta el momento de su intervención. Vamos a comenzar el panel con la intervención del profesor Nicolo Gligo, oficial de Asuntos Económicos de la División de Desarrollo Productivo y Empresarial de la CEPAL, cuya ponencia se titula Lineamientos y propuestas para un plan de autosuficiencia sanitaria para América Latina y el Caribe. Profesor Nicolo, por favor, tiene la palabra.
Sí. Buenos días. Gracias, Rainier, por la introducción y gracias por esta invitación que se le ha hecho a CEPAL a poder presentar lo que ha sido este plan que denominamos de lineamientos para autosuficiencia sanitaria de la región. Voy a ver si es que puedo compartir pantalla. Acá estoy viendo cómo se hace. No sé si tengo autorización para compartir pantalla.
PowerPoint. Si le decía que quiere compartir un PowerPoint,
¿sí?
¿Una ponencia? Sí, puede hacerlo.
Que no me lo permite, parece el sistema acá.
No le permite el sistema. ¿Tiene usted el permiso para poder hacerlo? En la opción compartir pantalla, que está en la parte inferior de su monitor, la tercera opción.
Aquí parece que aquí está.
Sí.
Ahora sí.
Muy bien, ya lo tenemos ya.
¿Ya lo tiene? Perfecto. Ya, yo veo solamente mi pantalla, no los veo a ustedes, pero vamos a ver. Entiendo que tengo 20 minutos y como les decía, agregué esta invitación que se hizo a la CEPAL para poder presentar este plan de autosuficiencia sanitaria para América Latina y el Caribe. Este plan que elaboró CEPAL fue hecho a solicitud de los países de la CELAC, que pidieron apoyo para realizar un plan integral que busque la autosuficiencia sanitaria, específicamente enfocado en el fortalecimiento de las capacidades de producción y distribución de vacunas y medicamentos en la región. Esta petición fue hecha a principios de este año, en marzo de este año, y fue presentada y aprobada el 18 de septiembre en una de las asambleas de la CELAC por los distintos países miembros. Para poder hacer este trabajo, CEPAL generó y aprovechó lo que llamó un observatorio sobre vacunación. También generó un grupo de 20 expertos de distintos países en los temas de vacunación y de industria farmacéutica. Realizó algunos diagnósticos, algunos estudios específicos sobre la industria farmacéutica del sector de salud de la región. Generó también un inventario de capacidades, hizo una revisión de cuáles eran las capacidades en los países y generó también algunos encuentros entre expertos y entre países para finalmente terminar con este documento o este plan que fue aprobado, como les decía, el pasado 18 de septiembre. El documento, el plan, cuenta de 3 partes. La primera es un análisis y evaluación de las capacidades de lo que denominamos el complejo industrial de la salud. Este plan tiene una mirada eminentemente de política industrial. Perdón, tengo un eco en el permanente en los micrófonos. No sé si alguien puede apagarlo. Sigue. Bueno, continúo entonces. Sí, sigo con el eco, pero voy a continuar igual. Entonces, como les decía, esta primera parte es una primera parte de diagnóstico y análisis para pasar. Y las líneas de acción, ahí sí. Y finalmente una tercera parte que son los anexos, que es un inventario de capacidades. Y en esta presentación voy a centrar básicamente las primeras 2 partes, algunos elementos de análisis y principalmente entrar a la propuesta de líneas de acción. La motivación del plan es bastante clara. O sea, América Latina es un país que, si bien actualmente ha mejorado sus niveles de vacunación, sigue presentando diferencias con lo que está ocurriendo en los países más desarrollados. En tanto lo que es adquisición de vacunas, pensando en todo lo que son los compromisos anticipados que han realizado los distintos países para adquirir vacunas. Por ejemplo, si uno considera la Unión Europea, Estados Unidos, Reino Unido, Canadá y Japón, que están concentrando el 45% de los compromisos de compra anticipada de vacunas, representan solamente el 13% de la población mundial. Los distintos países han realizado esfuerzos por adquirir estas vacunas, y hay que reconocer que la situación ha mejorado sustancialmente con lo que era la situación hace 6 meses atrás, y eso se ha traducido en que también los niveles de vacunación de la región han mejorado con lo que eran 6 meses atrás. Los datos que están acá son los datos recogidos el día de ayer de Our Walling Data, y muestran los avances ya en la vacunación. América Latina, si consideramos 19 países, el 53% de la población ya tiene su esquema de vacunación completo, en comparación con el 67% de la Unión Europea y el 61% de Estados Unidos y Canadá. Sin embargo, los países pequeños caribeños tienen una tasa muy baja de vacunación actualmente, logrando solamente llegar al 12,4% del esquema de vacunación con esquema de vacunación completo. Es decir, si bien uno pudiera decir que si toma los países latinoamericanos, igual hay un mejoramiento de la vacunación, hay una alta heterogeneidad dentro de los países, que es lo que se puede ver en el gráfico de la izquierda, donde uno tiene países como Chile, Cuba y Uruguay, que tienen sobre un 75% de su población vacunada con un esquema de vacunación completo. Sin embargo, en el otro extremo tenemos países como Jamaica, Nicaragua o Haití, con tasas muy bajas de vacunación. Haití incluso bajo el 1% de la población con un esquema de vacunación completo. América Latina, desde el punto de vista de todo lo que es productos farmacéuticos, los medicamentos y principios activos, es un importador neto. Si bien hay industria en varios países, hay una industria local desarrollada, esta se dirige principalmente a lo que son medicamentos de tipo genéricos, siendo las importaciones de los productos más innovadores, producidos por las empresas internacionales, los que generan este déficit importante entre lo que son las exportaciones y las importaciones. ¿Ya? Un déficit permanente, y es parte de las características de esta industria dentro de la región. Lo interesante es que el comercio intrarregional no es bajo, de todo lo que son las importaciones, el 13%, 14% de las importaciones de productos farmacéuticos en la región proviene de países de la región, siendo los países más pequeños los países que tienen una proporción mayor de importaciones de países desde la región. Por ejemplo, ahí en el gráfico de la derecha tienen Guatemala, Paraguay, Nicaragua, tienen sobre el 50% de los productos farmacéuticos que importan vienen desde países de América Latina y el Caribe. Por lo que ya existe un comercio intrarregional relativamente importante, por lo que pudieran haber también espacios de mayor integración sobre la base de estas experiencias previas. La industria farmacéutica en sí mismo es un sector estratégico, no solamente por la posibilidad de acceder a los medicamentos y resolver los problemas de salud de la población, sino que es un sector manufacturero interesante en sí mismo por sus características. Tiene, en comparación con otros sectores manufactureros, tiene mayor productividad, es más innovadora, tiene una mayor proporción de trabajadores calificados, provee salarios más altos y además tiene una composición de género bastante equilibrada. Y está más orientada hacia el mercado interno que el promedio de la industria manufacturera. En la región, uno puede identificar, si nos vamos específicamente al tema de vacunas contra el COVID, uno puede identificar algunos desarrollos. Obviamente un caso bastante ejemplar y poco característico en la región es el caso de Cuba, que ya ha desarrollado, que tiene 5 vacunas en desarrollo, 2 de ellas en ensayos clínicos, Soberana 2 y Abdala, que están ya en fase 3. Por supuesto, esta información es más interesante para aquellos participantes que no son cubanos. Aquí yo a todos los cubanos les estoy hablando de cosas que ya saben, pero aprovecho de contarles para el resto. Tienen dos vacunas, Soberana 2 y Abdala, y Soberana Plus, que sería una vacuna de refuerzo. ¿Ya? Los datos, lo que hace diferente a Cuba del resto de los países es que es el único país de América Latina que está satisfaciendo las necesidades de vacunación de su población con una producción propia, y no solamente producción, sino que un desarrollo de investigación y desarrollo de una vacuna propia. Y actualmente hay conversaciones y se está empezando a utilizar esta vacuna en algunos otros países de América Latina, como Nicaragua, y conversaciones con Venezuela. Brasil y México también están desarrollando sus propias vacunas. En ambos casos tienen convenios de cooperación con Mount Sinai y la Universidad de Texas. En el caso de Brasil, Butantan ya está en fase 1 y 2 combinada de ensayos clínicos, y en el caso de la vacuna Patria estaría entrando en fase 2 en México. El resto de América Latina hay algunas investigaciones incipientes, en Brasil, en Argentina, Ecuador, Chile, Perú, pero ninguna de ellas está aún en fase de ensayos clínicos, todo en fase de ensayos preclínicos. Lo que está un poco más avanzado es que hay varios acuerdos de producción de las vacunas desarrolladas por laboratorios internacionales en la región. El caso más interesante, porque desde el punto de vista que involucra a 2 países en la producción, es el promovido por la Fundación Slim en México, para producir la vacuna de AstraZeneca Oxford en la región, El ingrediente activo se está produciendo en Argentina y el envasado final, la fabricación y envasado se está produciendo en México. Al 26 de octubre ya se habían producido, se habían entregado 29 millones de dosis y la capacidad estimada está entre 150 y 250 millones de dosis al año. AstraZeneca también está produciendo en Brasil. Por ahora, la primera etapa sería de importar el ingrediente activo para una segunda etapa poder producirlo también en Brasil por la Fundación Fiocruz y ya a octubre habían entregado 113 millones de dosis. La Sinovac, la empresa china Sinovac, está también produciendo en Brasil a través del Instituto Butantan. Ya completó el primer contrato y la entrega de los 100 millones de dosis y se encuentra en negociación de un nuevo contrato. Sinovac también anunció que empezaría a producir con una fábrica propia en Chile en el próximo año y hay acuerdos de entendimiento con Colombia también para producción de vacunas. Pfizer, BioNTech, con la empresa Eurofarma en Brasil, tendría un acuerdo para empezar a hacer el envasado y llenado, el llenado y envasado en Brasil de su vacuna. Gamaleya, Sputnik 5, los rusos. En Argentina ya han producido sobre un millón de dosis al 20 de octubre. En Brasil también tienen acuerdos de producción y en México también tienen acuerdos de producción. CanSino, la otra vacuna china, está produciendo en México, en Querétaro, y ha entregado 9,9 millones de dosis y hay conversaciones, como les decía en el caso de la vacuna Abdala, para producir en Argentina y en Venezuela, así como también Chile tiene un proyecto de desarrollo y producción de una vacuna italiana. Es decir, en América Latina, si bien hay poco desarrollo de industria local, a lo menos los países más grandes, Argentina, México y Brasil, se están produciendo una cierta cantidad de vacunas, muy orientada en el caso de Brasil a lo local, y en el caso de AstraZeneca y México a una orientación un poco más regional. La pandemia de alguna forma hizo evidente las limitaciones que teníamos para el abastecimiento de vacunas y medicamentos y la alta dependencia que tiene la región de las empresas internacionales, tanto lo que es producción dentro de algunos países como por supuesto lo que es importación. Y así también la pandemia puso de manifiesto algunos problemas de los sistemas de salud de atención primaria, ¿ya? Por otro lado, hizo evidente todos los problemas relacionados con la investigación y desarrollo tecnológico y la debilidad de las políticas industriales, porque los países no estaban preparados para responder con producción o con capacidades locales. Y principalmente una descoordinación entre los sistemas de salud y los sistemas económicos o los sistemas industriales. De hecho, parte de lo que quiere lograr este plan de autosuficiencia sanitaria, que vamos a pasar a revisarlo enseguida, es poder hacer una coordinación eficiente entre varios objetivos de política. Por un lado están los objetivos de política de los sistemas de salud, que lo que busca es responder a las necesidades de salud de la población, pero en ese esquema no está tan preocupado si es que la producción es local o importada. En cambio, los sistemas relacionados con el desarrollo industrial están preocupados del desarrollo de esta industria, y los sistemas de ciencia y tecnología están preocupados de poder generar investigación y desarrollo. Y en la medida que podamos coordinar estos objetivos y podamos combinar estas políticas podemos hacer una mejor sinergia entre estas capacidades. Y por otro lado, lo que se quiere lograr en este momento también con este plan es apuntar a la integración regional. ¿Cómo hacer para que los distintos países puedan en forma conjunta satisfacer esta necesidad? Y por eso el plan de autosuficiencia sanitaria propuesto por CEPAL y aprobado por los países de la CELAC apunta básicamente a aquellas acciones a nivel de regional, de coordinación regional, de cooperación regional. Cada uno de los países, por supuesto, tiene que desarrollar sus propias capacidades internas, pero la mirada de este plan es hacia, como decía, hacia estas acciones que van hacia la coordinación regional. Entonces, el plan originalmente está solicitado para lo que llamamos estos objetivos de mediano y largo plazo, fortalecimiento y generación de capacidades tecnológicas y productivas, ¿ya? Pero, dado la urgencia de responder a los problemas del COVID, agregamos algunos objetivos y algunas acciones de corto plazo para acelerar los procesos de vacunación. Y en ese sentido, lo que queremos hacer, por un lado, mejorar el acceso a vacunas y también facilitar el proceso mismo de inoculación. En el mediano plazo, tenemos que asegurar un mercado estable y de gran escala. Las empresas, el sector productivo, va a invertir en capacidades solamente en la medida que puedan ver un volumen estable para poder rentabilizar sus inversiones. Por otro lado, necesitamos fortalecer los sistemas de investigación y desarrollo en la región y facilitar la producción a nivel de cadenas regionales. Una pregunta, Reinier. ¿Cuántos minutos me quedan para ver cuánto más profundizo en esto?
Puede disponer de 3 minutos, profesor.
Perfecto. Entonces no voy a salir de esta lámina.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Bueno, entonces, para llegar a estos objetivos, lo que propusimos fueron básicamente siete líneas de acción. Estas 7 líneas de acción por un lado, están basadas en parte de el análisis anterior, parte en esta mirada de que tenemos que integrar y responder a los objetivos de los sistemas de salud, pero también al sistema industrial, y en particular toma en cuenta algunas características propias del sector o la industria farmacéutica. En particular que, por un lado, es una industria altamente regulada, una de las más reguladas en el mundo. Y la regulación afecta no solo a los temas de salud o seguridad de los medicamentos, sino que también tiene efectos directos sobre qué tan rápido o qué tan lento puede entrar un producto en el mercado, facilita o no facilita el comercio internacional, y por lo tanto afecta directamente las decisiones de inversión de las empresas. Es un sector, otra característica, es un sector que depende mucho de los temas de propiedad intelectual. Es un sector donde la rentabilidad de las nuevas inversiones se da por el acceso a los sistemas de propiedad intelectual. Por último, es un sector que necesita de recursos importantes para poder hacer el desarrollo de lo que son los nuevos medicamentos. Entonces, las líneas de acción apuntan, como decía, a estos tres elementos más parte de lo que fue el análisis que le presenté anteriormente. Y, por un lado, tenemos una línea de acción directamente a trabajar con los mecanismos, las entidades regulatorias, para poder avanzar hacia lo que es la convergencia y reconocimiento sanitario. Una segunda línea que es implementar una plataforma regional de ensayos clínicos con el objetivo de generar eficiencia, escala y coherencia en la evaluación de vacunas y medicamentos y tratamientos. Una tercera línea que es acelerar los mecanismos regionales de compra de vacunas y medicamentos en el corto plazo. Una cuarta línea que es crear consorcios para acelerar el desarrollo y la producción de vacunas y medicamentos. Una quinta línea que apunta a aprovechar las flexibilidades de los acuerdos de propiedad, de la propiedad intelectual y negociar ante la OMC para acceder a mejores beneficios y articular finalmente los sistemas de compras públicas para crear un mercado regional estable y de gran escala. Cada una de estas líneas, después si es que hay tiempo, las podemos conversar en el mismo debate. Y este documento que les acabo de contar muy someramente está disponible en español y en inglés en la página web de la CEPAL. Y con eso espero haber hecho ha sido muy somero, pero espero que con esto quede una idea más o menos clara de qué se trata este plan y la importancia que tiene para la región el poder avanzar a esta soberanía sanitaria.
Muchas gracias, profesor Rodrigo, por tan interesante intervención. De hecho, le comunico que hay varios de los ponentes y usuarios que nos siguen que están interesados en tener su intervención en inglés, si es posible, en algún momento compartirla para la comprensión de los otros participantes en profundidad. Muchas gracias por sus palabras. Nos continuaremos con la intervención, con la ponencia de la profesora Tania Crumbet, quien es directora de investigación clínica en el Centro de Inmunología Molecular de Cuba y que nos trae como temática la experiencia cubana en el combate a la COVID-19, las oportunidades para la cooperación en ese orden en el escenario internacional. Bienvenida, profesora, tiene usted la palabra.
So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I will try to make an effort to make the presentation in English because we have been seeing that there are some participants that could not understand the presentation. So even though I prepare it in Spanish, I will do my best to transmit our messages. So I apologize if I make any mistake. Please, you can present the slides. So I also prepared the PowerPoint presentation, so I will make a huge effort to finish on time. So my name is Tania Crumbet. I am now the Clinical Research Director of the Center for Immunology in Havana, Cuba. And I have been participating in the COVID fight, as many Cuban doctors. So still we cannot share the slides. So we have been facing some technical problems. So I apologize for this. Can you see it now? So can you see the presentation now? Okay, I will proceed. So the topics I will address in my presentations are related with the COVID situation in the world and in Cuba. Then I will try to explain briefly what we have done in Cuba regarding epidemiology and therapy of the COVID-19 patients. I will share our results in facing COVID-19. Even though my colleague made a very good explanation about the Cuban vaccines, I will continue explaining about our strategy regarding Cuban vaccination with COVID-19 vaccines. Then I will describe briefly, as my previous colleague did, the situation of the vaccination worldwide, and then I will finish by describing the challenges global in the case of similar situations. Okay. So the next. So this is the update that I made today in the morning. So very briefly, this is the situation in the world. In Cuba, in the US, I selected US to make a comparison. So roughly, I would like you to see the number of patients, the number of deaths, and the recovery rate. So making a short summary, more roughly 260 million persons have been sick of COVID, and more than 5 million deaths have been occurring as a consequence of the disease, and worldwide the recovery rate is 90%. In Cuba, we have also been facing a very complicated situation. Roughly, we have been dealing with 1 million sick persons, 960,000 ill people, among which 8,000 have died, unfortunately. But the recovery rate is very high in Cuba. So we're very proud because we can claim that the recovery rate now in Cuba is 99%. While in the US, the number of cases is very high, 48 million. The number of deaths is roughly 800,000, and the recovery rate is not impressive. It's roughly 80% of the cases. The next. So I should explain that this is a consequence of a single protocol. Next, please. Because in Cuba, we established it since February 2020, a joint committee between the research institutions from BioCuba Pharma, which is the holding of enterprises of the Cuban biotech and pharmaceutical industry, and the Ministry of Health, to take the decisions, the strategic decisions regarding COVID. So we created what we called an innovation committee that was integrated by many researchers and experts. And the main specialties were virology, immunology, biochemistry, pharmacology from the main institutions from Cuba, and also the Cuban regulatory agency that we call it SECMED. And also in this innovation committee, there were a lot of clinicians, mainly from the intensive care specialty, internal medicine, cardiology, hematology, nephrology, pneumology. Those were the most important specialties that discussed it and approved the Cuban protocol. In addition, we did have a group devoted to the modeling of the epidemic, mainly composed by mathematicians and epidemiologists. And also we have another fourth group that was mainly focusing on the sociodemographic studies and the psychology studies associated with the pandemic. For example, in the case of the Innovation Committee, we were responsible to discuss all the research protocols that we implemented. And in Cuba, we implemented more than 400 research tasks, including more than 200 clinical trials. And we recommended the approval to these clinical trials to the Cuban regulatory agency. And also we established a central institutional review board to somehow expedite the approval and the implementation of the research. We also discuss it internally, the results from all the clinical trials, and we make the recommendations to the Cuban protocol, and we define it, the Cuban protocol that was applied in all the institutions in Cuba. So we have to say that in Cuba, we have a single protocol, and now we are working on version number 7 that was updated periodically. And we have been having deep discussions weekly in order to either design the new clinical trials or to discuss the results that we were obtaining that somehow modify the Cuban protocol. I have to say that we do not only discuss the results from the Cuban research, but also we discuss it in deep, all the international results, and we incorporated the best drugs that were available, provided our situation with the Cuban embargo. So I will go deeper on this issue. So regarding epidemiology, we have to say that in case of diagnosis in Cuba, we are very proud because all the patients in Cuba were diagnosed by PCR. So we needed to establish several labs. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we only have 3 labs, and now we have 27 labs to make the PCR diagnosed, and the timing for deliver these results is less than 24 hours. So we are very proud on that. So all the Cuban cases we can claim now that were confirmed by real-time PCR. And then we established the protocol for active search of the cases by the Cuban medical students So we visited all the cases, and in fact, more than 28,000 students visited every day all the cases, all the homes, in order to grant the active searches of the new cases. Then we did something which is unprecedented worldwide, which is the treatment of all the cases that were confirmed. So I think that Cuba is the only country in the world that established the therapy of all the COVID-19 patients with Cuban drugs. I will refer later to the Cuban protocol and what we did regarding antiviral therapy. So we treated all the patients, and we also isolate all the contacts of these confirmed patients. We did that until we started vaccination, in which the situation started to change, and it was not mandatory to isolate or to internalize in the hospitals or the confirmed cases. So regarding the therapy, I have to say that the portfolio of the Cuban protocol encompassed 27 drugs, and we are very proud because 85% of this portfolio is being produced in Cuba. And as you might be aware, the COVID-19 disease can have two major stages. One, which is in which the antiviral drugs are most important, and then there is a second step in which the inflammation is the main cause of the aggravation of the patient. So we also have several anti-inflammatory drugs that were reprofiled in order to treat the patients. In the case of the antiviral drugs, Cuba could not access to some of the American drugs, including remdesivir or molnupiravir, which are the recently approved antiviral pills. But also we did not have access to the antibodies the cocktails that had antiviral actions. That is why we used our interferon alpha, recombinant interferon alpha, and then we also have a combination of interferon alpha and interferon gamma that, when used timely, at the beginning of the disease, were very efficacious in controlling the viremia. So in Cuba, we are very proud because 1 million Cubans roughly received a combination of interferon alpha or gamma or interferon alpha alone. In addition, we developed a formulation for nasal administration of interferon. So we call it nasalferon, which is the very same recombinant interferon alpha, that it is very easily to administer it, and we have been using either as a prophylaxis in the red area and also as a therapeutic. So once we started vaccination and it was not necessary to hospitalize all the patients, we administered the nasal interferon even at the primary care systems, so at the homes of the patients. So in our cases, we were able to administer these antiviral therapies at home. So in addition, as I explained it before, we did not have access to other antiviral drugs that were developed in the US or that were very expensive, which is the case of tocilizumab, which is anti-interleukin 6 receptor antibody, which is from Roche. But we were very successful in reprofiling some of the drugs that we were developing for autoimmune diseases. And in such a case, we have at least 2 monoclonal antibodies that were already approved in Cuba, one for psoriasis and the second for cancer, and a third peptide with immunoregulatory properties that we call it Jusvinza, that it is very good molecule, that it induces an increase of the regulatory T cells and control the inflammation, which is the main cause of the severity of the disease at the latest stage of the disease. Next. So as a consequence of this protocol, we can claim very proudly that the case fatality rate, which is the lethality rate in Cuba, is very good. So in Cuba, we have 0.86% as case fatality rate. So I have selected some of the figures from the rest of the world. For example, you can see Mexico, 7.6. That means that 7% of the patients in Mexico have died as a consequence of the disease. In Brazil, this fatality rate, I did this update on November 22nd. In Brazil, is roughly 3, is 2.78. In Italy, in much more developed countries, the recovery rate is much worse. Is worse as compared to Cuba. So we are very proud that even though we're a very poor country, we were very successful in having a very good recovery of the Cuban patients. The next. So I have to say that we also face a very complicated situation when the Delta variant of concern arrived, and then we have a huge number of cases from July to September. That is why I am comparing here in this chart the number of cumulative deaths per million of people. So in Cuba, we have 700 deaths per million of people, and even though we have this huge increase after the Delta variant of concern arrived, because unfortunately this Delta VOC arrived before we were able to vaccinate the whole population. Our number of deaths as compared to the rest of the world is also very favorable. You can see the figures from Brazil, Argentina, the US, even Mexico, the United Kingdom, even Chile, the European Union, France. So even though, again, we are a very poor country, we prioritize treating the patients and allocating all the needed resources, and this is why we have a lower number of deaths per million of people. And then again, the recovery rate in Cuba is 99%. In the rest of the world is 90%, as I said before, while in the Latin American region is 86% as a whole. I have to say that one issue which is very important is that the early therapy with interferons granted that the number of patients in the intensive care units in Cuba never was higher than 2% of the patients. This is very important because we did have shortages of ventilators, oxygen, but as we decided in the innovation committee to provide interferon alpha, by the way, that was the origins of the Center of Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in 1996, we were able to recover most of the patients, and only 1 to 2% of the patients progress to a severe or critical stage of the disease. Next. Then I have to refer to the Cuban vaccine candidates. I have to say that we developed 5 vaccine candidates, among which 3 are already approved by the Cuban agency. So we can say now that we have 3 Cuban vaccines approved for COVID-19, while still Soberana 01 and Mambisa are being evaluated in the clinical research. And I have to say that we did very rigorous clinical investigations. So we did from more than 20 trials from each vaccine from the phase 1. We optimized the formulation, the dose. The phase 3 from Abdala, which is one of the vaccines that was approved by the Cuban agency, included 48,000 patients, while in the second trial that already established the heterologous vaccination because we established the first 2 doses with Soberana 02, and then re-immunizing with Soberana Plus, in which we enrolled 44,000 patients. So I have to say that the Cuban vaccines are very safe in additions. I think that are the safest in the world because the Cuban vaccines are protein subunit vaccines composed by the recombinant receptor binding protein, because we were able to produce the RBD, which is the most important region to enter the cell. So we have the production either in E. coli and also in Chinese hamster ovary, so in mammalian cell culture. And in the case of the Abdala, this is only a combination between the RBD and the adjuvant, which is alum, while in the case of Soberana, we are adding a carrier protein, which is tetanic toxoid, and in the second candidate, which is Soberana 01, we are combining with an open membrane protein from Neisseria meningitidis, which is the meningococcus B vaccine. And these vaccines are being used in the infant population for years. So this is why they are so safe, and it was a platform that Cuba has a lot of expertise. The next, please. So regarding the efficacy data, you can see the efficacy data. In the case of Abdala was 92%. In the case of Soberana was 91%, even though when we submitted the publication, it was even higher. So after the data were mature, the efficacy data to prevent the hospitalizations. I mean, the symptoms of the disease was 92.4 in the case of Soberana, and this efficacy data again compares very favorably with the rest of the vaccines that has been approved. I have to remark or highlight again that we did the trials in Cuba when we were facing the Delta variant of concern, which is a very high transmissible strain in which the replication speed was 1,000 times higher as compared to the previous variant. Again, next. It is very important to highlight that Cuba, even though it is not acknowledged by the big press, Cuba was the first country in the world to start the vaccination in the pediatric population. So since September 1st, we started to vaccinate the children above 2 years old. And now we can claim that we have vaccinated 1.9 millions of the children in Cuba, and we have started the schools without any concern. In addition, the vaccines are so safe, and we did a special trial for that applied to the pregnant women and also the breastfeeding women. And we have also established the vaccination of the convalescent patients, because in some patients there is not a high response after the disease. In Cuba, we have a different situation because since we treated all of them and we applied interferon, so the viral replication was not so high in many patients. So in some convalescent patients, the protection is not high even after having the infection. So we have decided to establish a strategy to vaccinate the convalescent patients. So we have now started vaccinating all these convalescent patients after 60 days of the disease. And we recently approved the booster strategy because we're also characterizing which is the duration and the neutralization capacity of the antibodies, and we have realized that after 6 months it is mandatory to reimmunize the population, and we have stratified and we have established the prioritization. So we will start by the health workers and also the vulnerable population, and then we will reimmunize the whole population in the way that after completing the first scheme, they can receive a booster injection. I have to say that the vaccination has been instrumental to reducing the transmission, not only the severity of the disease and the mortality rate in Cuba. Now we can claim that even though the lethality rate was 0.86, the cumulative from March 2020, now in the last 7 days, we have 0.16 as the number of deaths per million people. And this once more compares very favorably with the data from from the large, big number of countries, including the most developed regions, like the countries like the US, Germany, the high-income countries as a whole. So I think not only the good protocol and the therapy of all the patients, but the vaccination, the population vaccination has been the key issue in reducing dramatically the number of cases and the number of deaths. So I am almost finishing. I apologize. The next, please. So I have to say that this has been possible, firstly, by the political will and the absolute prioritization of the facing of the COVID by the government, even in the very complicated situation of the reduction in the internal gross product by 13% and the enforcement of the blockade. Next, Cuba has a very solid health system. So in Cuba, the life expectancy is 79 years, is universal, is of course for free. The infant mortality is 4.9 in the last year. Cuba has the highest rate of physicians per population in the world. Cuba has eliminated more than 14 infectious diseases. Next, please. I will go faster. We also have even cancer vaccine that we are working in the US. Next. And then we also have a biotech industry that is one of the most matured in the South. So this is the number of patents, and this is the number of enterprises that encompass the Cuba biotech and pharmaceutical industry. So in total, we are 20,000 employees and 34 enterprises and 61 manufacturing facilities. Next. I have to say that before the pandemic, our industry was able to export to more than 50 countries, and we have roughly 800 marketing approvals outside Cuba. Next. And also we have GMP classification of our productive areas, and which is more important, that we have been able to transfer our technology to the South. So those are some of the examples that the factories and the biotechnology transfers that Cuba have been done in the latest years, including Biomanguinho in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Vietnam, in China, in Argelia, in India, in Iran, in Thailand. So we have been an example of what can be done regarding technology transfer in the latest years. Then there is a huge inequity in the vaccines. I will not go deeper in that. The previous speaker made a good point on that. Cuba has one of the highest vaccination rate in the world, including at least one vaccine, partial vaccination and complete vaccination, the next. And this is the vaccination rate worldwide, next. And I think, next, please. What is most important is, for example, that the COVAX mechanism is an illusion so far. So the COVAX mechanism has been only to provide 25% of its initial commitment. So the initial commitment was to have vaccinated 40% of the population by 2021 and 70% by 2022. Next. And I think that those are the vaccines which are approved by the WHO, but the inequity in the vaccine distribution has very serious consequences, because even the health employees in the less developed countries are not being vaccinated. The vulnerable population from these countries are not being vaccinated. And even though this is, of course, an ethical and a moral issue, from the point of view of the health, this is the worst handling of the pandemics, because this has the consequence of the prolongation of the pandemic, because new variants which are resistant will emerge, and the vaccines will not be able to protect us anymore. So it is very important to grant the equal access and to apply the compulsory licenses to the patents, and to facilitate the technology transfers, and to grant the public funding to the research. And then I said that we have to criticize that many of these pharmaceutical industry, including Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech, did receive a lot of funding, public funding, to make this research, while they are profiting from these vaccine sales, because they are making a private appropriation of the earns after selling these vaccines. And finally, I made some recommendations regarding of what can be done. La última, por favor. La última. Very brief. Happy. So which are the challenges for the future? I summarized that we need to transform the model which is established of the capitalism and consumerism, that established that implies at the end that the richer countries are every day more richer, while the poor countries are every day more poor. That we have to establish a new economical order which is more rational, and we need more solidarity. We need that the countries accomplish their commitment and allocate at least 0.7% of the internal gross product to the international cooperation, which is the goal established by the United Nations. We have to solidify the sanitary systems from the poor countries, and we have to facilitate the human resources formation and facilitate the access to the technologies in the South. It is very important to claim that there is a very important role of the state and the international organisms in the access and to control the prices of the drugs. And we should claim for independence of all the countries regarding pharmaceutical production. And then we can also defend that we have to continue working on the climate change, because there is a huge risk of reemergence of new diseases, and also some extinguished diseases can reemerge after this climate change. Thank you very much, and excuse me for this delay and this very long presentation.
Muchas gracias a la profesora Tania Brombet por actualizarnos sobre este importante e interesante tema para la humanidad y para los cubanos acerca de los resultados que ha tenido la biotecnología cubana en términos de enfrentar la COVID y también la capacidad demostrada de cooperar con otras naciones del mundo en el enfrentamiento de esta pandemia. We continue with another interesting topics. Professor Sacha Giles, whose topic is a comparison of the medical and political response to COVID-19 in Australia, New Zealand, and Cuba. Please, Professor Sacha.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. First, before I start, of course, thank you to CIPI, thank you to CLACSO, and of course, all of the other presenters. It's a real privilege to be able to learn so much about so many different parts of the world. So yeah, look, the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has really demonstrated that healthcare and politics are inextricably linked. Indeed, the capacity of nations around the world to respond to the challenge of the pandemic and care for their citizens adequately has been directly influenced by political and geostrategic interests. And now the three island nations of Australia, New Zealand and Cuba have recently been compared due to some of their similarities, which is quite interesting. Because in spite of the fact that they're so distant from each other, they share some commonalities. Chiefly, they have robust, well-funded public healthcare systems. And this allowed them to respond quite efficiently, quite well to the challenge of COVID-19, at least at first. And while this medical response has been discussed quite widely, the exploitation of responses to COVID as a political tool hasn't, and particularly in the case of Australia, New Zealand and Cuba when making these comparisons. And I think when we do make the comparison of these three countries during the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, it demonstrates that Cuba and New Zealand, which pursued policies in their national interest, maintained a firm and unified commitment to prioritising the protection of their citizens, not only in a medical sense, but also in a social and an economic sense, which is equally as important during this time of pandemic. So there was genuine, honest government action, which built confidence and trust among the public, which enabled both countries to weather the internal challenges faced by the pandemic, as well as external challenges. And of course, in Cuba, this includes the ongoing assault of the US blockade and deliberate attempts to destabilise the island, which we saw particularly in July this year. Now, the Australian experience, by contrast, is a little bit different. So on the surface, it might have seemed like Australia had quite an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is true, particularly last year. But recently, there's been a lot of internal conflict between my country's two major political parties. A lot of political stunts. An election is coming up. And a lot of neoliberal concessions to the business community and the business class that has led to a pretty chaotic and inefficient stage of our response to the pandemic. It's led to inequities in the distribution of vaccines and access to vaccines across the different states of Australia, the emergence of far-right movements because of the vast amounts of disinformation that attacked the healthcare response in Australia, extended lockdowns and even geopolitical tensions with our neighbours in Asia. Now, I'll be brief with the part about Cuba because it's already been covered a lot. But of course, Cuba as a socialist nation and society implemented policies in response to the pandemic that were in the best interests of the general population. And this sort of political will, as Tania mentioned, to sort of care for the people manifested itself very early, even as early as February, March last year, when the Cuban Ministry of Public Health established a series of training programs that involved around 95,000 doctors and 84,000 nurses to diagnose and treat COVID-19. Additionally, revolutionary mass organisations like the Federation of Cuban Women and the Committees for the Defence of the Revolution assisted in an awareness-raising campaign, which ensured that citizens across Cuba were well informed about the dangers of COVID-19 and how to protect their communities. And this sort of community solidarity was really key, I think. And, by March, when the number of cases sort of began to increase a little bit in Cuba, the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, announced a new series of measures to face the virus. Of course, it included social distancing, lockdown, and some pretty progressive social policies too that were really important. For example, the full payment of wages for Cuban state workers for the first month of lockdown, and then subsequently guaranteeing 60% of a worker's wage during these confinements when people weren't able to work. And of course, the rationing system that was already established in Cuba, was expanded, particularly to ensure that disadvantaged neighbourhoods received the necessary food and sanitation products that they needed. And this extensive social security in it, I think, really reflects the benefits of the Cuban socialist ideology and system in times of crisis, in which community well-being and solidarity is prioritised over economic or political interest. Now, Australia and New Zealand, as I said, bear several similarities with Cuba. I mean, clearly they're capitalist in their economic structure, which is a major difference, but both countries developed strong and electorally viable labour movements and labour parties with strong trade union and socialist influence throughout much of the 20th century. And as a result, governments in both countries continue to provide subsidies for basic doctors' services, free public hospital care, and subsidies for essential medication. Both countries also spend a bit over 9% of their GDP on public healthcare. And while it's the large government-funded public hospitals that are most renowned for their service and their innovation in the medical sector, there are very long waiting lists, sometimes months, even years, depending on the surgery or the type of assistance you need. Admissions are made on the basis of urgency, as government funding never adequately reaches the needs of the general population. And as a result of the inefficiencies or the inadequacies in funding of the public system, in both countries, there's also a second tier of health service, and that's called private health insurance. So that's available only to those who can afford it, and it offers coverage for fees required to have your own personal choice of doctor and access to private hospitals for access to any sort of service you like. Now, only about 30% of New Zealanders and 45% of Australians actually pay for private health insurance, but they're encouraged to do so by the government in a bid to alleviate pressure on the public system. So while we can say technically there is universal health coverage in Australia and New Zealand, it's by no means equal for everyone. And this, of course, is a symptom of the increasing neoliberalisation of our society too. These problems have emerged really in the last 10 years. They've become quite serious. But regardless, the government systems and networks that were already operating in both New Zealand and Australia allowed for a similar sort of organisational response to Cuba, at least at first, when COVID-19 arrived in our countries. Now, while distance and isolation were obvious advantages for Australia and New Zealand in controlling the pandemic, it's important to note that New Zealand's left-wing Labor Party presided over one of the most successful responses to the pandemic in the world. Now, when I wrote this, I got my data around the start of November 5th, so it's slightly out of date. But as of November 5th, New Zealand had registered just 1,510 cases per million people and only 0.09 deaths per million people. This is one of the lowest rates in the world, if not the lowest rate in the world. Now, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, together with New Zealand's Director General of Health, were directly involved and led the strategy of epidemiological control in New Zealand. So they offered regular press conferences with updates on new measures, daily case numbers, and other changes to the national situation. So in January, a month before the first cases appeared on the island last year, the National Centre for Health Coordination was established to manage the response to COVID-19. And this response was characterised by one of the harshest and most well-followed lockdowns in the world, but not the longest. So social distancing, bans on public gatherings, and the closing of businesses were all observed. And generally speaking, the vast majority of citizens adhered to the epidemiological regulations. So effective was this response that by June 8th last year, New Zealand had eliminated COVID-19 in the country, and all areas of the island returned to the closest thing possible to normal on June 11th, just 3 days later. So the new chief objective of the government was to continue defending New Zealand's borders and prevent any new cases of COVID-19 from entering the national territory. Now, a significant reason behind New Zealand's success was the fact that the Labor Party in power at the time had developed a lot of progressive policies, a very progressive program, including a commitment to properly fund the nation's healthcare system and implement a welfare-centric budget to properly support vulnerable members of society. So Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern implemented a response that clearly tended to the health needs of the population, and she called for citizen participation and solidarity. And to quote her, with unity, with fast support, and by caring for each other. So the clear advantage of a progressive government directing the pandemic response could also be seen in the social and economic policies that were implemented to support the vulnerable within the country. So there was a national subsidy scheme which was established to support small businesses. And in total, there was around $62 billion put towards that end. And that money chiefly was meant to go towards the employees of these small businesses. Unfortunately, there were issues with the misuse of these funds in some cases. But again, generally speaking, they were used for their intended purpose, which was to keep employees in work during the pandemic and make sure that they had enough money to survive. Additionally, the government put funding towards health and sanitation infrastructure, housing, water and transportation during the pandemic period. And an additional and very significant measure was the New Zealand government's decision to dedicate $56 million to support Indigenous Maori communities. And these have been traditionally marginalised, the Indigenous Maori people, since colonisation, and they remain some of the most vulnerable and some of the most disadvantaged communities to this day. So the fact that so much money was put towards them is quite an important measure. Now, the significant economic and social support provided to New Zealand's people, I would say, bears many similarities to the efforts of the Cuban government to first and foremost address the needs of the population and protect not only their health, but also their socio-economic well-being. So clearly the experiences of Cuba and New Zealand align in their rejection of politicising the pandemic. So again, just focusing on the needs of the population, in their calls for solidarity and citizen participation, and in their commitment to implement policies that benefited the entire population as opposed to specific interest groups. Now, Australia is perhaps the most interesting case study in that, unlike Cuba and New Zealand, political disputes and the strategic manipulation of the COVID-19 pandemic led to an unprecedented and challenging situation for the country. So Australia adopted many of the policies implemented in the other two countries, including social distancing, wage subsidies and harsh lockdowns to halt the spread of COVID-19. However, the political landscape in Australia led to a series of crises that actually still haven't resolved themselves. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how the Australian political system works, it involves a nationwide federal government and a number of state governments that sort of are responsible for managing the different regions of Australia. I suppose sort of similar to the US system where you have a federal government and the different states. So currently, Australia is led at the federal level or the national level by the right-wing Liberal Party, whose support base lies among the business community and the capitalist class. However, there are a number of state governments, including my own state of Victoria, that are led by the left-wing Labor Party. So again, very similar policies to New Zealand's government. Now, while the Labor Party-led parts of Australia opted for policies of applying containment and lockdown, right-wing Liberal Party-led states, and in particular the most populous state, New South Wales, advocated for open borders and loose restrictions, and sometimes no restrictions at all, to appease the business community. Now, the federal government, so the right-wing Liberal Party government, actively worked to undermine the efforts of Labor Party-led states in the fight against COVID-19, and particularly my state of Victoria. So Victoria endured the longest lockdown in the world to try and contain COVID-19, over 260 days. However, at every turn, these efforts were undermined and manipulated by right-wing politicians that were looking to discredit the opposing party. As I mentioned earlier, there is going to be an Australian election at the start of next year. So the parties are very conscious that, you know, anything that will win them more votes, even if it threatens the health and the well-being of the population, is something that they are willing to consider, which is quite scary, actually. So a clear example of this was in early September this year, when Australia's vaccination campaign was still struggling. The federal government took 100,000 Pfizer doses, vaccine doses that were destined for my state, and gave them to New South Wales, where a right-wing ally was in power. So this was a really sort of flagrant example of them essentially stealing vaccines that our state had purchased and giving them to the right-wing government in New South Wales. And this situation was even more controversial considering that earlier in the year, New South Wales had refused to lock down its borders after a local outbreak emerged there. And it was this outbreak of COVID that then spread to my state and to other states in Australia, which created new challenges for the entire nation. Now, this internal disarray was similarly reflected in the socioeconomic measures that were taken during the pandemic. So the most notorious failure was a significant wage subsidy program called JobKeeper, and that was designed to benefit large businesses under the pretense of financially supporting employees. So to give you an example, there was $6 billion in this program that went to large corporations that actually registered no economic loss whatsoever. They actually registered a profit during the pandemic, but they received $6 billion from this program. And there were many other business owners that didn't actually pass on the wage subsidy to their workers at all. They just kept the funds for themselves. There were also many industries that were excluded from this program, including the cultural and artistic sector, meaning that there was no universal support for workers across Australia. Additionally, few targeted programs were implemented for the most disadvantaged sectors of the population, and in particular, Australia's Indigenous peoples. Now, Australia's Indigenous population has been described by the United Nations as living in conditions worse than most of the third world or the global south, worse than some of the poorest countries in the world, including Haiti and including several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, in the last few weeks, there was an outbreak in Indigenous Australian communities. Where up to 7 people live in the same house in 2-3 bedroom homes. There's no hospitals to speak of in most of these Indigenous communities. The nearest ones are 3 to 4 hours away in major settlements. And sometimes settlements can go without electricity for 3 or 4 days. Just to give you an idea of how dire the situation is for Indigenous Australian communities. And there was no special program created to support them during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as of November 5th, Australia had registered 6,757 cases per million people and 70 deaths per million people. Now, compared to most other countries in the world, this is a commendable response, and we still have to recognise that. But considering how much wealth Australia has, considering how much previous experience we have in actually facing pandemics, and considering how many healthcare resources that were available to us, these numbers are far too high for Australia. Now, Australia, unlike Cuba and New Zealand, provides a clear example of the dangers inherent in a divided political system in which differing parties are vying against each other and placing political concerns above the well-being and health of the nation. And this lack of unity and clarity contributed to a feeling of confusion and mistrust among the Australian public. So Australia's challenges were further exacerbated by a number of domestic factors. And a clear example is the intense media concentration that exists in Australia. So there are no laws governing media monopolies in Australia, and as a result, there are 2 companies, Fairfax Media and News Corp, and they control over 90% of all media in Australia. In fact, we're regularly placed in the top 5 for the worst media concentration in the world. And in particular, News Corp, which is far right in its ideology, published vast amounts of disinformation during the pandemic that attacked Australia's vaccination campaign. They attacked the integrity of our healthcare professionals, and they even questioned the safety of our vaccines. And this led to the development of a far-right anti-vaccination movement, and they actually protested violently in my city of Melbourne in September this year. So some people estimate that around 10,000 far-right individuals, many of them linked to Nazi organisations, went out to protest against the healthcare measures that were being taken to protect people's lives. So this was really quite a frightening thing to see. I've never experienced anything like it, but it developed because of all this disinformation, all of this false information being published by our media that allowed this sort of movement to flourish. And such a large disenfranchised sector of the population has provided really fertile recruitment opportunities for right-wing groups in the country. And this is a symptom of Australia's failure to address the COVID-19 pandemic in an adequate way. In fact, every Saturday, so every weekend since September, the right wing has marched in my city against vaccinations, against against the healthcare measures being taken, and it still hasn't ended.
Excuse me, Professor Sacher.
Yep.
You should finish in 2 minutes.
Yep. Okay, perfect. I'm getting to the end. Thank you. In our international context too, the federal government utilised the pandemic as a means of building a new frontier of dispute against China. So early last year, after discussions with the US government, Australia singled out China and said that Beijing needed to be investigated for its handling of COVID-19, with no evidence unilaterally making this statement. And this has since led to a diplomatic dispute with China that has resulted in our largest trading partner sanctioning some of Australia's most important industries, and diplomatic communications have been all but suspended. And this has just escalated since that time. Australia joined the AUKUS nuclear pact in September this year with the United States and the United Kingdom. This is a direct provocation against China, under which Australia will receive nuclear submarines from the United States. And this violates the principle of our region, the Pacific, as a nuclear-free zone. And it further demonstrates that Australia and the United States are exploiting the complex medical situation that's been created by COVID-19 to pursue their anti-China policies. So again, I'll finish up now just to reiterate that, Cuba and New Zealand have clearly demonstrated that progressive and left-wing governments have prioritised the well-being of their communities and their general population, and they've staged very effective campaigns against COVID-19 in all respects. And of course, Australia, on the other hand, is an example of the dangers inherent in politicising healthcare measures and politicising the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, guys.
Thank you very much, Professor Sacha, for explaining these important ideas. We continue with another presentation. Professor August Nils, please, who is Professor of Political Science and African American and African Studies, Distinguished Teacher and Professor, University of Minnesota, USA. Professor, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. First, I want to thank the organizers of this event, CIPI, and others to be a participant. In addition to teaching political science at the University of Minnesota, I'm also active in the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, a solidarity committee in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. And on behalf of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, I want to thank the Cuban people and their leadership for demonstrating to the world once again how to act on behalf of world humanity. The progress Cuba has made in combating COVID-19 is an example that all of us should emulate, done under oppressive conditions of a 6-decade-long criminal blockade imposed by Washington and Wall Street. Only because the Cuban people, beginning in January 1959, made a revolution that they continue to defend, could they have done what they have in the battle against COVID-19. Never should that also important fact be forgotten, precisely because Washington and Wall Street have never forgotten that fact. And that is exactly why Wall Street and Washington are ceaseless, be it Republicans or Democrats, in doing all they can get away with in putting an end to the revolution. From their inherently selfish and narrow class point of view, the Cuban Revolution, as Comandante Fidel Castro explained long ago, is a bad example for the world's toilers. If the Cubans can do it, only 90 miles away, other toilers further away may be inspired to do the same. At this moment, Minnesota is experiencing one of the worst moments in the pandemic. Minnesota has a population half the size of Cuba, but has suffered more deaths than that of Cuba. About 9,000 deaths in Minnesota and about 8,000 in Cuba. In Minnesota, only about 62% of Minnesota residents have been fully vaccinated, while in Cuba, it is more than 80% of the population. Put simply, a greater percentage of the population in Cuba puts more trust in its government than the population of Minnesota, and for good reason. Given what the speaker from Australia just related, I should mention that Minnesota is the only state in the United States where the working class had its own political party, but it was co-opted by the Democrats in 1944, and why the Democratic Party in Minnesota is called the Democratic Former Labor Party. Because of that legacy, Minnesota's so-called social safety net is relatively better than that of other states, especially in the South, where racial slavery once existed. Nevertheless, that progressive legacy has deteriorated owing to the logic of capitalist relations of production. The difference between Cuba and Minnesota speaks volumes about the difference between two fundamentally different socioeconomic political systems, one based on prioritizing human needs in general, and the other that prioritizes private interests, specifically the profit motive. Cuba, in other words, has a lot to teach the people of the United States, the working class specifically, that another world is possible. Why, we again thank you. Washington and Wall Street's greatest fear is that its own toilers might be inspired by what Cuba is doing. Given how poorly the United States ruling class is performing, they have every reason to be fearful. And for that reason, we who do solidarity work here in Minnesota are realistic about the possibility of genuine medical collaboration based upon equal relations and interests. Our primary task, rather, is to educate working people here about what a difference a revolution can make. It is one thing for a people to take care of its own citizens, but it is especially significant when it looks out after those who aren't their citizens, people who don't look like them necessarily, people who don't speak the same language or to have the same beliefs. That's exceptional. That, I argue, is what so distinguishes Cuba. If there is one feature of the Cuban Revolution that has made solidarity work for our committee in Minnesota effective ever since we came into existence in 1990, it is the revolution's proletarian internationalism. Cuba, of course, has a long record of coming to the aid of the peoples of Africa, beginning with a request from the National Liberation Front of Algeria in 1961 to aid victims of French imperialism. In hindsight, it was the revolution's first international medical mission. Then later, the military and humanitarian aid that Cuba provided for the peoples of Angola between 1975 and 1991. More than 300,000 Cubans served in Angola during that period. More than 2,000 Cubans lost their lives, helping to pave the way to South Africa's liberation from the racist apartheid regime, commemorated in a monument in South Africa. For our Solidarity Committee that was formed in 1990, it was Nelson Mandela's visit to Cuba in July of 1991 that really put us on the local map. We publicized and spoke about his visit. We never get tired of quoting Mandela, who said to the Cuban people at the rally in Matanzas on July 26, 1991, were it not for what you did in Angola at Cuitacuana Valley, I would not be able to be here to thank you, unquote. And our audiences, especially African Americans, have never gotten tired of hearing Mandela's words. Fast forward to the summer of 2005, when hurricanes wreaked deadly havoc on the peoples who live in or on the perimeter of the Caribbean. I had a personal interest in those developments owing to my family that was living in New Orleans. To learn that 1,600 Cubans had volunteered without any kind of publicity to go to New Orleans with resources provided by the Cuban government to aid the victims of Hurricane Katrina was also heartening. And to learn how heartless the US ruling class could be in rejecting that selfless aid was a sobering reminder of why the survival of humanity depends on emulating what the Cuban Revolution has taught. Fast forward to summer, fall 2014, when the World Health Organization asked the Cuban government to aid in the fight against one of the most virulent viruses in history, the Ebola scourge. As Comandante Fidel explained, it's one thing to volunteer for a military battle with a known enemy. It's another to volunteer to fight against an invisible enemy. And that's exactly what almost 12,000 Cubans were willing to do, from which about 256 were chosen to go to West Africa for the battle. Cuba was the only government to organize its citizens to come to the aid of the West African peoples. In doing what the Cubans did in the fight against the Ebola scourge, they were objectively coming to the aid of peoples elsewhere in the world, including those in the United States. The Ebola virus, highly contagious, was only one airplane flight away from West Africa. We never tired of telling audiences to which we spoke about the also noble work of the Cubans in West Africa. And our audiences, again, were never tired in hearing about that also selfless work. What the Cubans did in the Ebola fight may be the most noble moment in the history of the revolution. It is against all of that background that Cuba's fight against COVID-19 must be seen. Only when the profit motive has been removed from interactions between humans is the selfless response of the Cubans possible. It explains why Cuba is willing to make available the vaccines it has developed for the world's toilers free of a profit-making motive. Only a socialist revolution makes that possible. It is also in telling contrast to capital's profit motive-driven response to the pandemic. And because the masses of Africa are not the profitable market for the capitalist vaccine manufacturers, they will be relegated to, at best, second place in getting the vaccines and medicines they need to survive. Cuba's contribution to Africa is not a one-way process. In his speech in 1991, welcoming home the last Cuban volunteers who had been in Angola, Comandante Raul Castro said the following, quote, "If today our combat experience has been enriched, if we are better trained and more ready to defend our nation, it is because together with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, 56,000 officers who went through the school of life and struggle in Angola, if our people are now prepared to confront any difficulty in the times ahead, if they are confident about themselves and their ability to resist, to continue developing the country and to succeed, that confidence reflects our experience of how we grew in the face of adversity and won in Angola. And if there's a people to whom we owe a lesson of stoicism, of greatness, of the spirit of sacrifice and of loyalty, it is the Angolan people who said goodbye to our internationalist fighters in an exemplary manner with love and gratitude," unquote. Cuba's proletarian internationalism in other words, has been indispensable in the survival of the revolution. The Minnesota-Cuba Committee, again, has been in place here since 1990. During that time, other committees in solidarity with movements elsewhere in the world have come and gone. We still exist because your revolution still exists. Without the Cuban Revolution, we have no other reason for existence. And for that, again, we thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nis, for referring several important topics of our common history. Thank you very much. We continue with Professor Sachin Chaturnel, who is Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, New Delhi, India. Professor, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. And it's a great pleasure to join all my very distinguished panelists this morning, evening, night. I do not know what time zones we are in. It's already past 9 here in the evening, so everybody is in a different time zone. But let me congratulate my dear friends from CIPI for getting all of us together and getting the very unique Cuba story here. I'm so grateful to Professor August Nemitz for telling us about the history. And I'm so glad that he reminded us of the great role that Cuba has played. And I also want to congratulate Dr. Tanya Trombat for capturing this essence of biotechnology revolution in Cuba, the great role that Cuba has played for promoting South-South cooperation, the great role that Cuba has played in terms of getting global health architecture in place. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to recall the way Fidel Castro and others made this great nation with commitment, with humanity at the central pivot of this process. This idea of shared concerns for the South without additional advantages for private interests is a great model. It's a motivation, it's inspiration for everyone to follow. It's also a great opportunity for us to see how things have moved forward. And I'm very glad that Professor Sasha has captured this comparison, very interesting comparison of New Zealand, Australia, and Cuba. And he has done it at the macro level, and he has also done it at the micro level, and he has analyzed. So my congratulations and greetings to this. Friends and colleagues, it's an opportunity for us to think in terms of how CIPI has thought of this global engagement and partnership today to see how global issues are emerging, and the idea that they have tried to capture today, as I gathered in the conference, is to bring forward the scenario of uncertainty for international relations. So I am trying to focus more on international relations. I am heading a think tank, a policy research institution in New Delhi. This policy research institution is established by Ministry of External Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of India. We are all independent economists and sort of focuses on international partnerships, international relations. RIS was established as a think tank for India's engagement, India's commitment for the non-aligned movement. And since then, we have moved forward as quite a few developing countries like Brazil, etc., are not part of non-aligned movement, but we have continued our focus on how South-South cooperation can go forward. And that's the area of work for me. I have been for the last 30 years working on issues related to India's international engagement and also on issues that are related to the partnership between the developing countries. And this has given us an opportunity to see how COVID-19 crisis has thrown up many new areas. I would cover only 4 features of this crisis. I would talk to you about a great role that Cuba has played, the idea of bringing in the issues related to the vaccine strategy, the broad contemporary challenges that we are facing. And I would also talk to you in terms of the biosecurity and disaster resilience that we are having. And the last point would be the efforts at the global level for weaponization of trade. And then I would stop. So before I get into it, let me bring to you this idea and the fact that India has so far provided vaccines to around 1.160 billion people. That's the number we have. And this number is really huge, with 6 million doses already delivered. On 1st of April, India gave exemption in terms of vaccination of people above 45 years, and on August 1 for people above 80. And now we are, with domestic vaccine in India, we are going to do vaccination for our kids above age of 2. So that's the kind of advantage. We have already provided vaccines as part of our vaccine matrix to around 140 countries, and to 66 countries we have provided support in terms of how they cope up with the crisis. Having said that, let me bring you to the great role, the doctor diplomacy and the great work during COVID-19 that Cuba has done. So great salute to Cuba for Global South and for providing leadership role with limited resources but greater commitment. And I fully agree with my very dear co-panelist, Professor August, when he says Wall Street in Washington. We need to understand that the forces that have been trying to defeat, they are trying to defeat the efforts and endeavors for creating global public goods. Cuba has succeeded in it. Be that hepatitis B vaccine, and be that set of range of cooperation with Africa. And I have personally studied how Cuba has provided assistance for polio vaccine to India. Cuba has provided huge support to Brazil for production of vaccines for Africa. So Cuba has played this great role, and I think COVID-19, they have not disappointed the world. They have proved again the leadership of research and development, and they have also provided huge support of almost 90% of their population getting vaccinated. So this great institution, great research work, manufacturing capacity, and state-owned conglomerates, BioCuba Pharma is one of the leaders in the world, and I rank them extremely high. I think they deserve, if at all, a great national, international prizes for these accomplishments. Friends and colleagues, when we talk about international security and international dimension issues, I think COVID-19 crisis has also brought on table the role of the global institutions and the need for us to see how biosecurity is becoming a central issue of concern for the South. COVID-19 crisis has raised this issue after SARS, MERS, Ebola, and the COVID-19 outbreak. In terms of the efforts we need at international institutional level to see how biosecurity is made important. WHO guidelines were clearly not sufficient. They required much more to be desired, and they required much more to be identified in terms of the source of the country. And we are still dropping in the dark. We need to work collectively as a global community to see how we go forward. I think Professor Sasha's point is very, very important for us to see how some countries have not allowed the things to move forward in terms of the gaps that have appeared, and I see the biosecurity very much linked with it. I also see an opportunity to link the disaster and disease resilient infrastructure to come up. And this is important for us to see how epidemics do not go forward. Friends and colleagues, it is also very important for us that small countries, small island developing countries, the SIDS economies, they have borne the burden of this. And all of us in the G20, when we asked for assistance, $675 billion assistance IMF agreed for. And can you believe out of this $675 billion, $375 billion have gone only for OECD countries. So rich are capable of coping up all the times, whether crisis or no crisis. It's the small island developing countries. And a very recent study by UNCTAD shows that for small island developing countries, the cost of import has gone up by 58%. Can you believe it? And that's the price people are paying. And this is where countries like Cuba are providing the great leadership of indigeneity, of indigenization of the development strategy, of believing in your own strength and the idea of self-reliance. So Fidel Castro's message of we becoming independent of developed countries and trying to create our own energy is important. And that's what Prime Minister Modi here in India is talking about with Atmanirbhar Bharat, the self-reliant India. And I think it's important for all South-South cooperation countries to see how they use their local development strategies, their own partnerships for their economic development. And I think it's very important that we explore that path of economic development of our own countries, of our own people. And that's precisely the Agenda 2030. That's precisely Sustainable Development Goals. What is it? It is about localization of development. It is about developing our own people, their own resources, their ability to fish. And this idea is important for them as we go forward. Some countries are also trying to use this tough situation for their own national economic advantage by disrupting the supply chains, by disrupting the container movements in the oceans, and also creating their monopolies on rare earth metals and creating a crisis of semiconductor industry. We need to be aware of collaboration and need to strengthen multilateralism, which is extremely important for us. The institutions like the WTO, the WHO, they are important. Even in agriculture, the institutions like IFAD, like World Food Program, like FAO, they should not be captured by one single country. Their top position should not be one single country. It's need for multilateral, multi-stakeholder participation. And that's where we require all of the world countries to come together. The South-South cooperation principles are important for us. And from that point of view, I once again would like to congratulate CIPI, CIPI for their leadership and for organizing this event and getting all of us together for South-South cooperation and reminding us of the great standards that Cuba has followed as part of a passion for compassion. And I see Cuba as a country that is providing this great leadership for our people and for our common destiny. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chin, for this important and interesting idea. Thank you very much. We continue with the presentation of Robert Van, who is Professor of Social Policies and Governance with School of Governance, University of South Africa. Please, Professor.
Thank you, and send warm greetings from South Africa to our host colleagues, CIPI in Cuba, and also send very warm greetings to my fellow panelists. So I think my presentation will overlap with a lot of the discussions that preceded my own. What I want to start with is to locate some of the interventions at present in relation to COVID within a wider framing of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism has emerged and conducted itself over the last 15 years, in particular since the 2008 crisis, what this has meant in terms of logics of solidarity. I'll make some observations on my own country. I will also make some observations on Cuba, and I will conclude with an observation on what we should learn from the Cuban response, in particular to the COVID pandemic, the Cuban response being embedded in a culture of social solidarity. So the first thing to say that the world is, of course, undergoing a fundamental transition, of which the social and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is only the most recent manifestation. From an era of economic polarization in the context of an unequal but politically mediated global political order dominated by neoliberalism, to an era now characterized by the combined effects of economic, political, and social polarization, first signaled in the coming to power in 2017 of Donald Trump, at the helm of a new imperialist USA, and which is sustained in the era of Joe Biden's presidency since 2021. The right-wing orthodoxy represented since Trump is not only deepening the destructive effects of the neoliberal project, it has also sought the commodification of all forms of social well-being, where the social rights of citizenship and entitlement of all citizens to an equal quality of education, health, and welfare, protected by a sovereign state, is being subjected to market forces. The new phase of neoliberalism, combined with right-wing economic orthodoxy, was not seeking to replace the role of the state in favor of the market. It had more ambitious plans. These were to occupy the state apparatus and utilize the fiscal resources of the state to displace the rights and entitlements of citizens to health, education, and welfare with market forms of provision. This means, in effect, that the state would become an extension of the market, and the role of the state would become limited to a managerial and coordinating role of social policies, while the market became the main agent of supply and delivery of social policies to citizens. In this new model of neoliberalism, citizens are transformed into consumers, and social entitlements to health and education are no longer a right protected by the state, but are provided through market forces. It was the very antithesis of a model of social solidarity, which is predicated on equitable redistribution of fiscal resources between the more affluent and the poor, the older and the younger, and the healthy and the less healthy. With the onset of lockdown induced by the COVID-19 pandemic in the beginning of 2020, an externally originating crisis in health led to a global economic crisis of such severe proportions that it exceeded the effects of the 2008 global financial crisis and compelled a break on the rampant neoliberal trajectory in order to prevent financial and social catastrophe in northern economies. With stock markets veering towards collapse and massive and unprecedented levels of unemployment, with the US, for example, registering 22 million unemployed in the first month of the pandemic, a massive fiscal government stimulus package was implemented to the tune of US 2.1 trillion in the United States, for example, and supplemented by monetary policy instruments of the central banks of the North, who slashed interest rates and injected liquidity into the markets. This countervailing impulse to the established neoliberal trajectory was, however, not aimed at ushering in a new socialist and solidaristic global logic, but was a pause in the trajectory of neoliberalism, predicated on a protectionist agenda to the predominant North and its interests. The continuing neoliberal underpinnings of the logic was evidenced, for example, in the fact that the production of a vaccine to combat COVID-19 became an overriding priority, and the stock in big pharma companies such as Moderna in the US increased in value by 135% on the news that it was making progress to developing, on the news that Moderna was making progress in developing a vaccine. So private accumulation continued apace in the North with selective economic and social benefits. The preservation and restriction in the North of health technologies and medical knowledge essential to combat the global health pandemic demonstrated again that the South cannot be reliant on the largesse of Northern benevolence. The head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, one of the most eloquent advocates in support of a global ethic of equity and humanity in the fight against the pandemic, drew attention to the shameful limits of the Northern benevolence in a speech to a UN Vaccine for All meeting recently. He reported that, and I quote, of the 832 million vaccine doses administered, 82% have gone to high or upper middle income countries, while only 0.2%, under 1%, have been sent to their low income counterparts. In high income countries alone, 1 in 4 people have been vaccinated, a ratio that drops precipitously to 1 in 500 in poorer countries. The US, EU, and UK also eschewed a global and equitable approach to the availability of the vaccine and hoarded vaccines through bilateral pre-purchase deals, itself facilitated by already existing trade agreements favorable to the North of the World Trade Organization. The lesson here is we must look to our own and build alliances of knowledge and cooperation across our southern spheres, which has been raised, of course, by my colleagues, to combat the social and economic challenges of our time, such as the pandemic. We would be particularly wise to recall the sage advice, the wise advice of Comandante Fidel when he said, and I quote, "We don't need the empire to give us anything," in response to the hesitantly correct but nonetheless feeble overtures of the Obama administration to Cuba. This advice continues to have meaning. In our own country, South Africa, the limits of northern benevolence is evident in the fact that pricing of the Oxford-produced COVID vaccine AstraZeneca sourced is highly commodified, with doses ordered in January 2021 priced at $5.25 per dose for South Africa, but which is nearly 2.5 times higher than the cost per dose paid by most European countries who have access to the same vaccine, according to our Ministry of Health. A subsequent scientific study in February 2021 in South Africa found that the AstraZeneca vaccine only offered minimal protection for South African citizens with mild symptoms of the COVID virus variants. So these 1 million dosages were sold to the African Union. South Africa now relies on the Johnson & Johnson single dose and the Pfizer double dose vaccines to inoculate its population. A combination of struggling to secure the vaccine in a context of northern vaccine hoarding, efficacy concerns with vaccines already purchased, and vaccine hesitancy has meant that we have made poor progress in our vaccination rates. Only 28% of the population have regrettably been vaccinated to date in South Africa. This must be compared with the extraordinary Cuban experience, where a combination of purposive mobilization at the highest levels of the state, through to the neighborhood public health committees, working synergistically with the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, allowed for a full community-level campaign of education and medical intervention to be rapidly institutionalized, and on an already existing foundation of a globally renowned universal system of healthcare provision based on social solidarity and established since 1959 following the triumph of the revolution. The Cuban achievement has also been secured in the context of an illegal blockade whose sole socially barbaric objective is to literally starve the Cuban people into submission and to erode Cuban sovereignty through 243 draconian Trump-era measures, which continues under the Biden administration. Despite these externally imposed attempts at undermining its sovereignty, Cuba has reported a world-leading vaccination rate of more than 84% for the vaccine, and without relying on the neoliberal logic and dependency creating benevolence of the COVAX facility, but through the development and manufacturing of its own vaccines, the Abdala vaccine, which reports a 92% efficacy rate, and the Soberana 02 and Soberana Plus vaccine, which reports a 92% efficacy rate. And of course, our colleague has given an excellent presentation on this. These remain unparalleled global achievements. In addition, Cuba has been at the forefront of international public health solidarity efforts to support countries in both the South and the North through the Henry Reeves International Medical Brigade, including in my own country. It is here, alongside the struggle to secure equitable vaccines, that health under COVID-19 conditions has become a site of global contestation between the Trumpian values of social barbarism and divisiveness and Cuban international values of social solidarity and global equity. This is no mere abstraction, as without understanding of the motivating forces of the Cuban Revolution, it is difficult to appreciate how Cuba has sustained its revolutionary project, despite the most adverse conditions, and what we need to consider is the lessons these hold for the South. For myself, through many years of research and travel to Cuba as a scholar of Cuba's culture of solidarity and its lessons for Southern Africa, I have, alongside colleagues from the University of Havana and scholars from Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa, sought to understand the spirit and tenacity of Cuban internationalism. Why are Cuban international activists in health and education the first to support the impoverished people in the most abysmal of emergency, disaster, and oppressive situations in the developing world? What is the motivating force? This can't be explained, as some US cynics will do, by compulsion. Humans do not perform optimally and with focus, vigor, and commitment in dire emergency situations, the way the first arriving Cuban medical brigade did in helping in combating the lethal Ebola virus epidemic in West Africa in 2014, in which my esteemed colleague has already spoken to. I think the concept that explains for myself the Cuban solidarity is best encapsulated in the term "y dignidad," dignity. This concept represents for me the meaning of Cuba's modern revolution that triumphed in 1959. Not on our knees and not as slaves. Dignity not only for ourselves, but all societies experiencing hardship and oppression. Under the most adverse and hostile conditions of intense US imperialist aggression since 1960, the Cuban people have triumphed because they have not been willing to sacrifice their dignity as an emancipated people, their freedom to choose and to decide their destiny as a free nation. Cuba sees the defense of their own hard-won dignity as unequivocally linked, though, to the dignity of other poor nations. It is written, in fact, in the country's constitution, and I quote, "Internationalism, fraternal friendship, help, cooperation, and solidarity of the peoples of the world." It has become embedded in the Cuban psyche. In this global context of crisis, there is a need for revisioning a global world order that is not dependent on the vagaries of the United States and its myopic policy agenda. In this, the developing countries need to forge social alliances based on alternative ideas and processes that reaffirms our mutual interdependency based on an ethic of social justice and social solidarity to the benefit of the many and not the few. There is a significant battle of ideas also taking place in South Africa over the future direction of our health policy, for example. It is here that Cuba offers a significant alternative to healthcare provision. The Cuban model is based on social justice as the primary value informing the system of Cuban healthcare provision, and the state ensures healthcare provision is provided to all citizens without regard to social status, race, disability, gender, or any other factor other than need. Cuba has also achieved these phenomenal outcomes in its healthcare provision comparable to and in advance of the most developing countries on the basis of a planned national system of healthcare provision provided by the state. Significantly for developing countries is the Cuban form of international social solidarity that has been training tens of thousands of medical doctors in the values, principles, and clinical practices of the Cuban model of healthcare provision. My own country, South Africa, has been a major beneficiary of the Cuban international solidarity, with thousands of South African medical doctors now being trained in Cuba. These South African doctors in Cuba are repositories of the knowledge of the Cuban model of healthcare and will no doubt and are making a fundamental contribution to the transformation of South African healthcare by introducing more egalitarian medical practices in the provision of our public healthcare. It is the most tangible form of the Cuban contribution to the battle of ideas over healthcare in my country, South Africa, and ensuring that the right to quality public healthcare provided by the state is affirmed in practice. The egalitarian model of Cuban public healthcare needs to be extended even further through the creation of centers of policy knowledge on social policy and healthcare, which can best serve as a foundation for what I would describe as a social alliance of policy knowledge across developing countries who are also engaged in the battle of ideas on how to establish health and education systems in their country that are not subject to market forces, but reaffirm the right of all citizens to enjoy high quality education and healthcare provided by their state. With the crisis that has emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is also an opportunity presented to form alternative centers of policy knowledge in the South, which challenges the orthodoxies and hegemony of the North. This may take the form of a global center for policy knowledge in health and education, which I've made mention of, that can undertake rigorous research, provide policy alternatives, both conceptually and practically, and advise and advocate alternatives on health and education based on principles of social justice and egalitarianism. In this endeavor, we have had a solid foundation in the Cuban experience, a starting point for such a new social alliance of policy knowledge for social justice. And it's this journey that we need to take with Cuba, where Cuba has been at the forefront of the struggles of the South and of Africa, as my colleague has mentioned, in liberating us from the dependencies of the North, that I think we will reach the conclusion of our journey, which is an interdependent South, which is mutually accountable, mutually responsible, and which shares knowledge in the interest of creating a societies based again on egalitarianism and social justice. I thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very important few ideas. Thank you very much. And we continue with the presentation of the Centro de Investigaciones de la Economía Mundial. Pero fue aquí la... que nos presentará Gladys Cecilia Hernández, decía del Centro de Investigaciones de la Economía Mundial, una ponencia que comparte con el doctor Ramón Pich, director del centro, cuyo tema ustedes pueden estar viendo ya en pantalla: cambio climático y deterioro socioeconómico global en tiempos de pandemia.
In the first place, I want to thank you, the colleagues for CIPI and colleagues from CLACSO and the other professors that are sharing this panel. Our topic is greatly connected to many of the references you have been given in your presentations. I mean, when the Dr. Tanya was talking at the end of her presentation concerning the importance of climate change and how humanity is supposed to follow what will become of these new viruses and how we should work to try to eliminate this. The connection is really very strong. The next, please. Those are the topics we want to share with you. The nature of the challenges that humanity face, taking into account that both of them, climate change and COVID-19, but also new viruses, are supposed to be closely interrelated. Both are challenges that affect all the people in the world. The second item is the strengths, the relations, interrelations among them. The fact that the more we reduce or lost natural habitats for animals and biodiversity, more we will have affectations coming from climate change. And of course, those elements favor the emergence and propagation of different pandemics. Then there is a third element, how we distribute the impacts. Actually, all the vulnerability of the developing countries strengthen under a crisis. And if we have a multi-system crisis, of course, you will have the vulnerable communities and the vulnerable countries more affected. And then there are the solutions. How is the scale in terms of time for solutions? Both the solutions for climate change or new viruses and pandemia demand solutions that are emergent and transformations in the medium and large period. And this is very important because we have just seen the closure of the 26th Climate Change Summit and the relations that we were waiting for, or the solutions we were waiting for in terms of how much develop adaptation or mitigation, of how much financial resources are supposed to be needed for that. We didn't see anything of that. I mean, this is really, really very sad because the interrelation among these two global challenges is really quite close. Then why we don't see that? I mean, we have the asymmetries in terms of economic development. You can see the next 81% of global population live in 140 countries in the developing world, and they mostly produce 32% of the exports, and 14% of the global population that resides in 39 industrialized countries generates 33% of the exports. So those are the inequities we are feeling. 13% of the global population that live in 45 African countries mostly produce 1.7 of the exports globally. And if we talk of the external debt in developing countries, it's okay? Mostly, can I see the other? Oh, we do have a problem with the external debt, and it's more than $11 trillion coming from the affectations and vulnerability of the developing countries. So if we see specifically how the economy has dealt in 2020 and how the crisis in terms of economic development is considered the major crisis since the Great Depression in the years between 1999 and 1933. There is a huge contraction in terms of growth, almost 3.9%, with a drop of more than 80% in the global trade. Then there is the vulnerability of the demand, the decrease in the tourism and the remittances, and of course, there is a drop of 34% in the year 2020 of tourism. Next. This is the dynamic that is prognosed by many foreign and international agencies. So feel free to see that in the year 2021, many of these institutions are prognosing growth of 5, 6, 7 for many countries, even for regions, Latin America. But we are seeing a different pictures and what is happening now, almost finishing the year 2021. The new tendencies for 2021, the next please, are supposed to be founded on the fact that the vaccination process could have a very huge impact on the economic growth internationally. But we know that nothing of this has happened. We have seen in the presentations of the other colleagues that actually almost 80% of the vaccines that were produced and sold in the world were accumulated by the developed countries. So whatever we have in terms of uncertainty, in terms of how the recovery can be different from one country to the other, how in terms of the develop of these problems in the developed world, major measures of fiscal maintenance for people were approved, and in the developing world, there were many countries who didn't manage to approve any fiscal contribution for those populations. In the case of the developed world, we have to developing well, we have to stress the fact that China, being the first country in experience the COVID-19, has been the only country that really has maintained a recovery in this year, 2021. And even in this case, we have seen some eruptions of new illnesses in the case of China. So they are waiting for a recovery of the world trade. Those are prognoses, of around 10% for the year 2021, but they never talk of the problems that the global trade is experiencing. For example, the fact that the transport prices in terms of shipping companies or airplane companies has increased almost 10%. And this affects directly the maintenance of a trade volume properly for many countries. The next, please. What are the main topics in terms of how the situation has created an emergency, but at the same time, we have not seen the emergency to be answered for? I mean, it's the huge gap in the cooperation. We have seen in the other presentations how the problem with the vaccination is going on. And then we have the problem concerning the transmission of local viruses that were supposed to get down by the end of the year 2022. But if we still keep in view that the uncertainty concerning the found that the vaccination programs are not so huge extended all over the country, all over the world. I mean, this is really very difficult to understand how they will really reach this maximum of stability. The next, please. Next. Then we have the social deterioration in terms of labor, in terms of salary. For example, from 2019 to 2020, 2021, the International Organization for Work is saying that almost 255 million million employments has been lost. And of course, in terms also of the income that is supposed to come from these employments, it's almost $3.7 billion, or almost 4.4 of the GDP in the world. And those losses in terms of income are especially concentrated in developing countries. There is also an increase in poverty and inequity. There is also a very, very strong situation and affectations for women, the younger people, the informal employees, and specifically in the informal sector, we have almost 30% of the activity in terms of economic development in very, very low countries affected. So this is a very important topic, how to face a global crisis economically, environmental crisis, social crisis, technology, if the percentage of the global debt is increasing. We can see, for example, that we are foreseeing that for the year 2030, this indicator in terms of global debt will reach $360 billion. And with this kind of debt, inflation pressures and topics concerning exchange rate are supposed to be influencing the global performance of economy. The next, please. So we can see, for example, that in terms of developing countries, the debt is almost 7 trillion after in the year 2012. But now we're talking of almost $11 billion. And the payment in terms of service payments for the debt are around almost $30 trillion in the period between 2012 and 2020. So how developing countries are supposed to face that? This is not only a problem for the developing world, but also for developed economies, see Europe or Asia or Africa. In the case of Africa, we have just listened to the professor talking of the problems that Africa usually has been experienced. Coming to climate change and being very brief, I will say that in terms of the pandemic, this is something that has become a global challenge. For example, remember that the task for the humanity, after all the global summits concerning climate change and before the global summit of Glasgow that have just finished, was to try to reach a global warming of 1.5 grades. This is impossible to reach now. I mean, the emissions have continued to increase. And in terms of history, there is an accumulation of historic emissions that only can be stopped if there is a real reduction in emissions. The concentrations of the principal emissions have been increasing. Even with this temporal reduction of the emissions in the year 2020 related to the closeness and to the confinements created by the COVID-19. This 2020, nevertheless, was one of the most warm countries in the last registered years. There is an increase, and there is a tendency to an increase of the sea level that has been quickening in the last year. So we have seen the melting of huge amount of ice in the so-called Antarctic and in the so-called south of the global planet. So there is also a very important increase of hurricanes, their frequency. The next, please. In the case of Latin America, we have that there are zones, regions that will experiment increases in their temperature. And of course, that the intensity and frequency of the drop also will increase, and they are increased already. Remember that many of those research that the IPCC is doing now through all these global reports are just showing how the scientists all over the world are recalling whatever experiences their countries are having in terms of climate change. And there are affectations, of course, that are in all the regions, but in terms of Latin America, some of the affectations and impacts will be related to food security in many, many zones of the countries. And South America also, we have foreseen and we have seen already an increase of forest disappearance. And there is also reduction of the capacity for the normal plantations. Please. The other. So in terms of renewable energy, I think that this is very important because there is a tendency all over the world to increase the production of renewables, taking into account the need to develop a transition to an economy with less carbon emissions. But of course, this is a tendency that it's supposed to generate it with the reduction of real fossil fuels. And we have experiences that are not so nice. For example, we were in the middle of the Glasgow Climate Change Summit recently, and in Europe, governments were just approving new subsidies for fossil fuels. I mean, how the world will confront these tendencies if renewables are supposed to be the most important thing to allow this transition, and we are not foreseeing how it can be done quickly. The next. We had a very interesting moment in the year 2021 when the United States called for a selected group of invitees, almost 40 different leaders in the world sphere, to initiate again some negotiations concerning the returning to the United States to the talkings or negotiation on climate change. And there was a compromise for the United States to reduce in 52% its emissions by the year 2030. This is a perspective of long reach and concerning this topic, but of course, there is a discussion inside the United States among the two main principal parties. And this is something that will have to be really developed to reach whatever they are proposing to do by the year 2030. The next. We have the possibility to develop, in the case of Cuba, a policy that considers adaptation and mitigation as to be the main sources to try to make advances in terms of diminishing our emission, even when the emissions in Cuba are not supposed to be the most important problem for the world. I mean, we're one of the less contributors to the emissions of the planet, but nevertheless, we have one of the most affected countries because of an island, because we are in the Caribbean Sea, and because in this Caribbean Sea we have a hurricane, very strong activity. We have different changes in our drain. We have frequency and extension of droughts, and Cuba has been experienced this kind of affectations. And of course, there is a very special moment for the Cuban climate that transits from its condition of tropical humid to tropical dry. This is a condition we are supposed to live with, and we are supposed to adapt to that. Next. So mitigation and adaptation are supposed to be the more important elements in the plan for developing the environmental programs in Cuba. The next. What are the main lessons? Just to try to close the ideas of this presentation. With the COVID, it was already clear, with the appearance of the COVID, that the neoliberal policies are really incapable to confront situations of emergency of this nature. And what is worst, even with the COVID, even with the uncertainty to eliminate the COVID today, they are still looking for policies and ways to confront that without affecting the roots, the real neoliberal elements, principles. So this is impossible. I mean, when we say that we have to change the consumption patterns of the neoliberal countries, this is because these consumption patterns affect the nature. Then there is another element. In this crisis, the role of science has become a more important one. At the same time, we have to stress the importance and the value of local development, because local development can help communities in every country to try to face the impacts, to try to develop from their own capacities answers to the scale of this local community. Then we have another lesson. For example, international cooperation is needed, but the real one, as Cuba has been doing, as Dr. Tania has been telling us in her presentation, this is something that the countries need, that the world needs, not just talk about this. And we know that in terms of international official aid, these figures have been diminishing actually in the middle of the pandemic. And at the same time, we have to consider from a very, very strict point of policies to include the environmental variable on the recovery post-COVID period, because this is important, because this is not the only pandemic that humanity can face. I mean, we totally, in terms of environment, in terms of how biodiversity adapts to the real conditions that the global planet is giving them, we will have more pandemics. And in this case, we will have to prevent, or at least to work with policies that can have help to face those elements. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to share my point of views with you.
Muchas gracias, profesora Gladys, por esta interesante presentación. Nosotros hemos terminado la intervención de los ponentes. Nos ha llegado una pregunta de nuestro colega Joslan Silverio, que se aplica, es decir, va dirigida al panel. Por lo tanto, podrán disponer de algunos minutos los panelistas que nos acompañan para hacer un comentario sobre esta pregunta u otra cuestión que quisieran puntualizar en estos minutos que restan. La pregunta dice: ¿cómo coordinar acciones colectivas para garantizar el acceso a vacunas a las naciones africanas vulnerables? Entonces, le doy la palabra en el mismo orden. Déjenme también destacar que el profesor August Nims y el profesor Sachin solicitan que los disculpen, pero tuvieron que abandonar la conferencia por otros compromisos y también la diferencia de horario. Por lo tanto, no se encuentran ahora en este momento con nosotros. Iremos dando la palabra primero al señor Nicolo Gligo, por favor.
A ver, bueno, la pregunta es para África, pero creo que es aplicable a todos los países. O sea, la forma en que los países acceden a las vacunas, los que no la producen, que es la mayoría de ellos, por supuesto, es ya sea por una acción individual, que algunos países, y es lo que ha pasado en América Latina, los países que más han avanzado son los que han hecho los mejores deals, los mejores negocios o los mejores acuerdos para la adquisición en forma anticipada de vacunas, o alternativamente a través de alguno de los mecanismos, de algún mecanismo conjunto. América Latina no ha hecho, salvo participar en el mecanismo COVAX en forma individual, y que el fondo rotatorio de la OPS representa a los países dentro del mecanismo COVAX, no se ha hecho algún tipo de acción colectiva. En el caso de África, entiendo que la Unión Africana ha hecho, tiene algún tipo de acción, y tal como la Unión Europea es un comprador de vacunas, la forma de hacerlo es como lo están haciendo, que sería en forma colectiva. La forma colectiva no necesariamente asegura el acceso privilegiado, pero por lo menos nos pone en una mejor posición de negociación con los laboratorios internacionales.
Gracias, profesor. Tenemos una intervención, una pregunta que van a realizar desde los colegas que nos acompañan en el teatro. Un minuto, por favor. Por favor, el doctor Nelson Roque tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias. Nelson Roque del CIPI. Thank you very much to all. Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to thank all the expositors in this panel. As we have seen, there are very big differences between countries in the world. Today, a big part of the world may dead because of new diseases, because most of the countries have not resources to avoid it. The solution is to change the global system that rules in the world, to put the human being in the center of the interest, not the money, not the business. But to reach that objective as a matter of time, the science may play an important role to diminish these differences. The unity in the objectives of the science may help to make things better. The real cooperation between more developed countries with the undeveloped countries. Thank you very much.
Gracias, profesor Nelson Roque. ¿Alguno de los panelistas nos acompaña a... La profesora nos va a hacer un comentario respecto a esta pregunta. Gracias.
So, okay, as the professor from Minnesota said, Cuba has a long history of cooperation with Africa. Particularly, he highlighted the cooperation regarding Ebola in 2014 and in 2015. And then I was very happy to hear that our colleague from South Africa also highlighted the cooperation that Cuba made during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the worst moment, Cuba have sent, it is important to know that Cuba have sent 57 brigades to 41 countries already during the COVID pandemic, mainly to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also to Africa and Asia, and even to Europe in the worst moment of the pandemic. We know that our medical doctors and nurses have been working in Crema, in Turin, in Lombardia, fighting. And we did have the gratitude from the people from these European countries and also from Andorra. So regarding the vaccines, I have to say that Cuba, as we have been doing before, is ready to cooperate. So the Cuban vaccines, are 3 of them are already approved in Cuba and in some other countries. Particularly, they are approved already in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Vietnam, in Iran, and they are in evaluation in 30 more countries. And so far, we have been also making technology transfer to some of these countries that have already requested Cuba. And in summary, I want to clarify that we are ready to cooperate with any international organization or country that can work together with Cuba to grant a better access to the Cuban vaccines, not only to Africa, but to any other country in which there is a low vaccination rate. The humankind can count on Cuba as always.
Muchas gracias a la profesora Tania Crombet. Nos dicen que desde el público hay otro colega que quisiera hacer una intervención. Por favor, ¿puede acercarse al micrófono? Toma el micrófono, sí, es importante.
Bueno, creo que el ponente al que iba referido a mi pregunta, creo que se desconectó y ya no se encuentra acá con nosotros en el evento. Es Sasha Gills de Australia. No sé si estará todavía.
No, ya por razones obvias de horario parece que tuvo que ausentarse. Pero igual si puede hacer su comentario o una pregunta.
Específicamente para Australia y Nueva Zelanda, así que en otro momento será.
Ay, muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que hemos tenido una ardua jornada, pero muy interesante, que nos deja seguramente materia de estudio obligada sobre estos temas que hemos estado discutiendo hoy y motivo para seguir cooperando en un futuro con los colegas que nos han acompañado y a través de las redes y en este evento. Nosotros los convocamos, los invitamos a que nos acompañen. A que nos acompañen mañana en la continuidad de la sexta Conferencia de Estudios Estratégicos, cuyo panel tiene como tema central la nueva geografía del poder a nivel global, impactos regionales y nuevas alianzas. Le agradezco a todos los panelistas que nos han acompañado hasta este momento. Muchas gracias. Espero que sea un motivo más para continuar la colaboración académica que hemos desarrollado hasta el momento. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Detener transmisión en vivo.